Hello everyone, Kirby fan here. Back with another copy ability spotlight. God, it's cold. Thanks to everyone who voted last time. There were an absolute ton of votes, and okay, this is gonna get really old really quick if I keep doing this, so thanks to everyone who voted last time. There were an absolute ton of votes, and I want to keep up that pace in this video. So don't forget, you're more than welcome to leave a comment letting me know what the next spotlight you'd like to see is. You can vote for any ability, unless I've already covered it, and you can see which ones have spotlights by checking out the playlist. Maybe, watch them all while you're at it. Oh, and I don't know, subscribe and ring the notification bell for the channel. Sounds good to me. I don't know about you. Anyway, the deadline for voting is January 12th, 2021, so if you're watching this video after that point, or you just don't feel like voting, let me know what you think about Ice. Is it better than you thought it'd be? Worse? I don't know, you can let me know if you're cold. Moving on, Ice is another one of those classic abilities that's been around since the very beginning and has stuck around since. It's got an impressive lineup of games, and it definitely stands out as a fan favorite. Part of this might be it turning Kirby blue in basically every game he's in, which is always nifty, but anything themed around cold things, like ice and snow, tend to be fan favorites in a lot of different media. But does Ice thrive in the fires of speedrunning and general optimized Kirby, or does it melt in the face of better abilities? Let's chill out and talk about Ice. If you've seen one of my spotlights, you've seen them all for Kirby's Adventure. Is the ability in question Tornado? If it is, yeah, it's good. And if it isn't, most likely, it's not great. There definitely are abilities other than Tornado that are good, but they're very rare and we actually haven't covered one of them in a long time. There isn't much new to say about Ice here. Well, I guess there is one thing, although it is very minor. Ice has a variation to it, which is Freeze, although you can give and take on which is better. Ice has more horizontal range and is largely similar to Fire, while Freeze is similar to Needle and Spark, except it actually surrounds all of Kirby like a defensive ability should. I mean, I guess Spark does this, but Needle doesn't, and that still bums me out. These are both better alternatives to the abilities that they're similar to. Freeze, for example, doesn't lag the game as much as Spark does, and is generally more useful than Needle, while Ice freezes the enemies into an ice block, unlike Fire. That said, you're really not going to use either of these in a speedrun setting for the most part anyway, so stuff like that really isn't all that important. It's much of the same story for Nightmare in Dreamland, although this game has a bigger focus on being good at boss killing, considering that, generally speaking, the good abilities for levels aren't the best for bosses. And while Ice is pretty weak, Freeze does slightly more damage and, compared to other boss killer abilities, has the benefit of freezing their projectiles and dealing very good damage with ice blocks. Unfortunately, better boss killers like Spark and Sword exist, which deal much more damage at the same speed. The ice blocks never actually come into effect because you can just beat bosses and mini-bosses before any projectiles even come out. Needle got a big range buff, so you could even argue that Needle is better than Freeze this time around. And as we went over last time, Needle is far from the best ability in this game. Ice in Kirby's Dream Land 3 is okay. Certainly not bad, with Q plus Ice acting as a pseudo replacement to Q plus Cutter after that huge nerf it got, but better damage dealing options exist now. In particular, Q plus Cleaning far outclasses it in terms of raw damage, and due to the game being on a console, without screen crunch, projectile spreads aren't quite as useful. As for Kind plus Ice, it just got straight up powercraft. Kind plus Spark, Kind plus Fire, Kind plus Stone, they all outclass it. I'll go into more detail on that later in Dreamland 2. It feels kind of odd to talk about Ice and Superstar Ultra without talking about Superstar first, but I'll keep it brief for the Superstar bit later. Ice and Ultra isn't necessarily bad, but is far removed from what it was in that game. A lot of the advanced stuff that made Ice as good as it was in said game was removed, and what's left is a fine ability, passable for mobility, offense, and defense, but not necessarily good enough for any of them. Chili's guard does make a sound at least. You're gonna want to remember that. Freeze in Kirby Air Ride has some problems. To start with the positives, it has more range on it than Needle, and if you hit its sweet spot, then it deals really good damage. And that's where the positives end. It may have more range than Needle, but the insane damage that Needle deals on top of always having a hitbox and better utility makes it a much better choice. Compared to other offensive abilities, Sword automatically hits enemies without the need to charge, and Tornado is effectively a speedy spin of destruction during its entire duration. All Freeze really has going for it is that sweet spot, but you're realistically never going to land it. Or at the very least, you won't be landing it as much as you will Needle, or Sword, or Tornado. It's generally considered the weakest ability in the game, other than Sleep. Unless you've seen the Sleep Spotlight, then you know Sleep is the best ability in this game. To go over Amazing Mirror and Squeak Squad real quick, Ice isn't viable in either of these games. The movement of these two games is a lot more advanced than Nightmare and Dreamland, so while in those games it's just a matter of being outclassed, in these two it simply isn't very good. Offensively, defensively, mobility, doesn't matter, it's outclassed. Wheel in these two games is especially good and kind of outclasses almost every ability, to be fair. In the Needle Spotlight, I went over how Needle had a small but excellent niche in Canvas Curse. Now imagine that exact scenario, only the niche is really not all that helpful. That's basically the situation that Freeze is stuck in. The momentum boost that it gets is good, but inferior to just looping, so that benefit is out of the picture. Freeze gives Kirby increased gravity, which isn't needed for most stages, but for something like Cold Course, it's very useful. The problem in this case is that the increased momentum isn't nearly enough to make up for Ice's total lack of availability. Mix isn't a thing in this game, and fighting Ice is pretty difficult. Would you really go for this when you can just use looping, which is faster, easier, and more practical? It could have more use if it was around more often and had a better niche, but here we are. At least it's in Canvas Curse where most abilities struggle, but still not very good. Ice in both Kirby Triple Deluxe and Kirby Planet Robobot shares the same unfortunate issue in any percent. In Return to Dreamland, a dash attack was added to Ice's moveset, and for some reason it was removed in these two games. I'll get into why that's a pain, but not the end of the world for Planet Robobot later, but with no alternative options for Triple Deluxe, it can't carve out a niche for any percent at all. Kirby Battle Royale just does Ice dirty. It's the last ability you unlock in the story mode, once again giving it awful availability. It's in the group of abilities where it's totally fine for the most part, but the time it takes to change abilities in the story mode just isn't really worth going off of the abilities that are overall the best. It does fare a lot better in the multiplayer though, considering its charge attack is an ice wall that blocks other players off. Add on top of that some very good range on its attacks, and yeah, it is very good for pretty much all of the games in Battle Royale. Multiplayer. Well, we're talking about the single player here, and it's about average. And with that, we move on to the games that Ice is actually good in. For the most part, Ice wasn't bad, but I wouldn't call it good in any of these games. Underwhelming. But for the games that it's good in, well, let's just say that we've got a lot to cover. Let's not waste any more time and get into the good stuff. Oh man, I missed my chance to make another ice pun. I'm bad. Well, let's start off tame. While Freeze isn't the most useful ability in Kirby's Dream Course, it has a very important niche that no other ability has. That being, if you're about to fall in water, for all you golf gamers out there, imagine being stuck in the bunker, except it's even worse. You can use Freeze to let Kirby ski across the water and not fall in. For both speedrunning and hole-in-ones, I shouldn't have to explain why this is invaluable, but on the same token, I don't think I need to explain why it's so niche. It's the best ability in the game for avoiding the water, but that's all it really has to set it apart. It doesn't help for speedrunning by stopping you before hole-in-oneing like Needle, but it doesn't provide movement for hole-in-ones like High Jump, at least out of the water. Where Freeze fares much better is in the multiplayer. While I've skipped Dream Course's multiplayer in recent spotlights due to most abilities having the same role in both single and multiplayer, Freeze has the added benefit of keeping your opponent frozen for a turn if you hit them with it. In a multiplayer game like this, where every turn matters, you could argue that Freeze is just straight up the best ability in the multiplayer. You know, except for UFO, but come on, it's UFO and Kirby's Dream Course. Hello! Ice in Kirby's Dream Land 2 faces steep competition with other combinations. For normal Kirby, every ability loses to Kirby plus Burning, and only a select few, such as Kirby plus Parasol, can even compete. Koo has the deadly Koo plus Cutter combination that patches up Koo's one and only problem, which is damage, while combinations such as Koo plus Parasol all but invalidate damage while not sacrificing much. The benefits that Koo plus Ice or Kirby plus Ice give just can't compete, although Koo plus Ice, similar to Dreamland 3, is actually pretty good, just not as good as Koo plus Cutter. As for Rick, he's irrelevant. Sorry, buddy. You get your time in Star Allies, I promise. Where Ice fully shines in Dreamland 2 is the Kine plus Ice combination. It functions similarly to Freeze, except unlike the Adventure Nightmare version, you can move around while you're using it. It basically makes you a fully mobile shield. That's all well and good when Kine is on land. Jumping with Kine actually gives him good enough mobility. But using Kine plus Ice underwater, where Kine moves way faster, makes the ability as powerful as it is. Entire sections of the game that would seem challenging with any other ability or any other animal friend, speedrun or casual, are just nullified with this combo, to the point where abilities that work similarly, such as Kine plus Needle, just straight up aren't very good. And now you get to learn about why Ice being not so hot, or I guess cold in this case, in Superstar Ultra is a big deal. And it's because, no surprise, Ice in Kirby Superstar is truly a one-of-a-kind ability. Compared to later games, abilities in Superstar are very input-heavy. While having very high skill ceilings despite being, overall, very easy to use is nothing new for Kirby, abilities being very input-heavy is pretty uncommon. To start with, let's cover Ice's mobility. It's not jet or anything, but what it has is a very fast initial dash. You can compare every other abilities to Ice's and see the difference. What makes this a big deal is that, unlike every other ability, in any Kirby game, come to think of it, you can cancel Kirby's initial dash with anything and carry that momentum. And when I say anything, I mean anything, including another dash. What this results in is some of the fastest ground movement of any ability in the game, as long as your hands can keep up. Ice's offensive potential is no slouch either, and has even more layers to it. Let's start with the easy one. Freezer Suction, Ice's command grab, deals a lot of damage. No surprise there. What's cool about this version of the move, though, is that if the projectile Kirby spits out hits a wall, it bounces up before it disappears. And that bouncing bit is still an active hitbox, meaning it will still deal damage. It's not big and mostly impractical, but noteworthy for mini-bosses and even a bunch of bosses, like the Combo Cannon and Wispy Woods. Well, if you ever get to the point where they bring out the projectiles, because what truly makes Ice a good offensive ability is some next level tech. Ice has Freezer Blizzard, a dash attack that, say it with me now, functions like Freeze. This version you can get out by pressing the attack button a couple times like in the later games, but that's not what's important. What is crucial that, at any point after the Freezer Blizzard starts, you can cancel it with either a jump or with a guard, meaning you can pull off crazy tricks like this. While I can't speak for the Eastern speedrunning community, using the guard after the Freezer Blizzard, sorry, I just really love how KSS named this move, it sounds so dumb, was referred to as L-canceling in the Western community for a while. And yeah, I think that's accurate. Combine this with how fast Ice is on the ground, alongside some niche but fun and sometimes even useful tech, and you have one of the most technically impressive abilities in the entire franchise. And of course, with it having Freeze in its moveset, it's got some pretty great defensive utility as well. Now, with that being said, you don't actually see it very much in an any % speedrun. That's mostly due to Jet outclassing it in most cases, but that doesn't by itself make Ice bad. Compare Ice to Plasma, which is the best ability in the game for boss fights. It outclasses Ice offensively and arguably defensively, but it doesn't have the movement potential that Ice has. Wing has better mobility, but is outclassed in terms of dealing damage, especially dealing with bosses. Ice basically has it all, and unlike your standard jack-of-all-trades, it excels in all areas. Oh, but to offset that, Chili's Guard doesn't make a sound. Awful ability. Next, Kirby 64 is dominated by fire. Single or double fire both have their perks, but fire all the same. Other abilities have their use for fighting bosses. Ice is not one of them, but for the most part, the most important ability is fire. That being said, Ice actually does provide some real use for movement in the form of the Curling Stone, Ice plus Stone, due to the initial dash being very good. We just talked about initial dashes, didn't we? Well, on the bright side, it's much easier to get the perks here than in KSS. You just need to time your B presses properly, and you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. In the 100% category, it's used a fair amount, and while it doesn't have nearly as much use in any percent, it actually functions kind of like stone when Kirby is underwater, moving him down much quicker than simply swimming down. I'm not entirely sure why it works like this, I guess because it's a stone ability, but it's better for underwater than fire is at the very least. Similar to KSS, it's inferior overall, but still excellent. I also have to bring mention to Ice plus Spark for not only turning Kirby into a refrigerator, you don't see Epic Yarn doing this. This is another one of those not too helpful for speedrunning, but removes any kind of challenge from the game abilities, since if you take damage, you can immediately heal it back off, and that breaks any game where the engagement comes from not taking damage. I also have to mention Ice plus Fire, since they're probably the overall best abilities in the game, and when they're combined, they make the one joke ability in Kirby 64, and said joke ability actually isn't half bad. You gotta love this stuff. And then, 11 years later, Kirby's Return to Dreamland stars one of the best Ices yet. For any percent, it's outclassed by Wing, as is everything, but it still has some excellent traits. It does very well against every single boss, while still being one of the few abilities in that regard that retains excellent mobility. It lost the cool tricks that it had from Superstar, similar to Ultra, but it got new tools to help it out. For any percent, the big one was the inclusion of a dash attack, Ice Ball, performed by pressing down and 1 during a dash. It's a great tool for moving around, better than even Wing's dash attack if you're strictly talking about ground movement. Because Return to Dreamland is so reliant on Wing, you always need to have a backup plan if you make a mistake and lose it, or do a run without using Wing allowed. You see stuff like this most often in races, and if you're stuck without Wing in one of these, Ice is a perfectly viable replacement. Definitely one of the best, possibly the overall best, with some steep competition such as Fire, Water, Tornado, and Parasol. Where Ice shines even more, as I alluded to earlier, is in the arena modes. Excellent doesn't even begin to describe how good it is, being the third best ability in the entire game for clearing them out. It's even the best one for a couple of fights, beating out Hammer, the boss-killing king. Between Ice Ball, Super Ice Sprinkle, the Ice Suction and Ejection, and Freezer Ice Storm. Kind of boring, but okay. It has plenty of tools to excel. It's pretty exciting, all things considered, since most abilities rely only on 1 or 2 moves, and here's Ice using most of its kit. Even though Ice lost Ice Ball in the transition to Triple Deluxe, that was only part of what made it excellent at killing out bosses. It still has the rest of its great kit here, and while it isn't as dominant as it was there, it's still great for tackling the arena modes and even has the fastest time for Dark Day-to-Day. Ice is down, but not out. And trust me, it is about to make the comeback of a lifetime. Before we get to that though, we need to talk about Ice and Planet Robobot any percent. Without Ice Ball and mobility, it's still pretty limited in what it can do outside of boss fights, which is now more valuable than it's ever been. Don't worry, we're almost there. The real perk is that Ice got a Robobot ability, and it, like every Robobot ability, is very good. Probably among the worst abilities that the Robobot armor can get, but considering how often you use the armor, even in any percent, it gets use and is definitely good. Alright, now to start getting technical. In Superstar and Superstar Ultra, bosses had invincibility periods where they couldn't be attacked after getting hit. These varied from boss to boss, but this period existed for every single one. In Return to Dreamland and Triple Deluxe, this was almost entirely removed, but it was still there. In Planet Robobot, it was removed entirely, allowing faster moves to be way more viable than ever at the cost of them being much harder to use at a max skill ceiling. Bringing this back to Ice, it turns out that, without boss invincibility, Super Ice Sprinkle kind of tears through every boss fight in the game. Remember when I said that it was number 3 in Return to Dreamland? Not even close. Ice is a dominant top 2 ability, almost having more best boss time records than even Hammer. And Hammer in this game is arguably the best that it's ever been, too. In fact, Hammer and Ice are very close in time, only being milliseconds apart. Actually, what do you know? Ice has the better time. Times change, and despite Hammer being unbelievably powerful, Ice is just that much faster. It is, however, much harder to make work. And you can definitely make the argument that Hammer is better because not only is it only milliseconds apart, but it's significantly easier to use. Unfortunately for all of the Ice fans out there, myself included, I'll be making that argument, but Ice in Planet Robobot is unbelievably powerful, just barely behind Hammer, and faster. Ending this off, Ice and Kirby Star Allies got the Ice Ball back and put Ice right back into a great position for any percent. DLC didn't so much hurt it in the main mode, since the time it takes to go into a dream museum and get a friend isn't worth the time, and the Mage Sisters you can't even get in there anyway, so its main competition are the 2 abilities you'd expect, Wing and Sizzle Shuttle Loop on Meta Knight. Whereas many runners will play without piggybacking, playing without Wing really is not as common. Still, as I've said numerous times, just because Wing is really good doesn't mean that Ice is bad. Ice Ball is actually better here than in Return to Dreamland, since you can act out of it a lot faster now. Ice has seen some other changes across really all the modern games, but the biggest change specific to Ice all involve the Ice Ball. That isn't all there is to say about Ice though, since it gives the Blizzard element. And depending on what you're looking for, it ranges from average to the best element in the game. For any percent, it's very good because it freezes enemies, but is generally outclassed by the speed and strength offered by the Sizzle element. And for the perks that it gives during the enemy rushes, we're about to get into that, don't worry. For boss fights, obviously Bluster is the best because of Air Bomb spam, but the one thing that Rick, Kine, and Ku are missing out on is the Ice element. For both any percent and the few bits of the ultimate choice, when progression is stopped by normal enemy encounters, the game counts the Blizzard elements, freezing them as knocked out immediately. No waiting for the enemies to be zapped or burned or blown away, especially in Guest Star Allies where these are everywhere. This saves a remarkable amount of time. As for Ice in the ultimate choice, not its element, it lost its top spot due to the discovery of Air Bomb spam, but even prior to all of that, Hammer seemed to be the way to go. With the caveat that it was boosted by the Ice element. I always loved that. Hammer and Ice, the top 2 of Planet Robobot, tag teaming and losing to Bomb of all abilities. Even Hammer, King Dedede, was generally seen as better too, so oops. You never know what you're gonna get when you look into boss rush speedruns in Kirby. It's a roll of the dice, it feels like. It's so much fun. And with that, we reach the end of yet another copyability spotlight. Now for the ever-important question, was Ice any good across all of these games? Well, for starters, Freeze was kinda bad, being largely useless in 4 of its 5 appearances, but Ice, on the other hand, was nothing short of excellent, with part of its success owed to being given Freeze, ironically enough. With only a small handful of exceptions, Ice was at the very least close to being one of the best abilities in most of the games it's been in. And in Planet Robobot, it's arguably the actual best, and will presumably be in that very same spot of excellence for many games to come.